Good evening. On behalf of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, I would like to welcome you to our first Primer on Primaries event, which we are sponsoring with our Bob Graham Center student fellows. My name is Teresa Cornacione, and I'm proud to serve as the center's civic engagement coordinator. Our center was founded by former Florida Governor and U.S. Senator Bob Graham with the mission to promote civic engagement, public service, and public leadership. Governor Graham has often remarked that democracy is not a spectator sport, and that citizens require the tools of citizenship to be full and active participants in our democracy. It is with this in mind that we bring you this program tonight. Presidential primaries are an intriguing and uniquely American way to choose our nominees for the chief executive. In many other democracies, political parties select these candidates internally. The difference here underscores the unique role that citizens play in our system. And we hope tonight's panel will provide and enhance an important tool of citizenship, a greater understanding of our system, and hopefully an increased desire to participate within it. And even though today's Florida primary is over, remember that it is never too early to register for the general election on November 5th. We have helpful volunteers here to assist you with all your voting needs, whether that's first-time registration, updating your address, or signing up for election reminders. They do work. We are here to help you use these tools to be a full participant in our democracy. Thank you for attending. And with that, I will turn the mic over to our student moderators for the evening. Austin Stein is a junior data science and mathematics major and is co-president of our Bob Graham Center Student Fellows. Andrew Taramikan is a senior political science and history student and serves as one of the center's student assistants for civic engagement. Please welcome Andrew to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Taramikan, as Dr. C said. On behalf of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service and the Graham Center Student Fellows, we are proud to present the primer on primaries. I'd like to begin this event by thanking the Graham Center itself for hosting this event and the work of our student fellows to present tonight's program, with a special thanks to Marianne Vernetson, who is the Fellows Advisor and Associate Director of the Center. Additionally, I'd like to thank Isa Garcia, the Events and Programming Student Assistant, Dorothy Zimmerman, the Center's Communications Director, Elizabeth Wheelahan and Leah Edwards, my God, my two fellow Civic Engagement Student Assistants, the Center's Administrative Specialist, Shireen Mohammed, as well as the student fellows who are here in the audience with us. Thank you all for working tirelessly over the past few months to put this very special event together and all the other amazing things we do here at the Bob Graham Center. And finally, I would like to thank you all, our panelists, for spending your time with us this evening, being here after hours to help, advance the interests and education of our student body here, and sharing your knowledge of our primary system. Now, before we begin, there's a few housekeeping items we'd like to note. Silence your cell phones if we haven't already. No need to be on it. Put it on Do Not Disturb while you're at it. And the forum will consist, just a note on how this is going to go, it'll be 35 minutes of moderated Q&A, after which point we will open the floor to the audience for questions. We're recording the event. It'll be shared on our YouTube page and other social media channels as well. So keep that in mind, that this event is being recorded. With that, thank you all for joining. Obviously, there'd be no event if it weren't for those of you in attendance today, so thank you guys. And I'm pleased to introduce my co-moderator, Austin, who has a little more in store for us.
Thank you, Andrew. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Austin Stein, and I am the co-president of the Bob Graham Center Student Fellows, as both Dr. C and Andrew said. And I'm also the co-moderator for this evening's panel discussion, so thank you all for coming. I am pleased to introduce our panelists for tonight. First off, we have Dr. Myiah Hutchens. She is a political communication scholar whose research examines how communication functions in democratic processes, that is, to help or hinder political processes. In particular, she studies what leads people to seek out diverse perspectives, particularly views they disagree with, and how individuals then process that disagreement. Hutchens' work can be found in several high-impact journals and has been cited over 2,000 times. She currently serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Communication, Communication Research, and Communication Methods and Measures. Thank you so much, Dr. Hutchens, for being here tonight. Dr. Suzanne Robbins is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and specializes in American politics. Her research focuses on policy and administrative studies and organized interests. She's also the director of the Masters in Political Campaigning program here at UF. Thank you, Dr. Robbins. And Dr. Mac Jacobs, finally, is an associate professor of US and international history, as well as the director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. He joined UF and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences in 2003. His research focuses on US Middle East relations. Professor Jacobs has taught courses on US foreign relations, US Middle East relations, the Vietnam War, and international studies. Thank you each for spending your evening here and for sharing your insights with us. We're very happy to have you. We will begin with moderated questions to each of our panelists, then we will transition to the audience Q&A. So to get started, I'd love to hear very briefly just your impressions about the current primary season from your respective positions as a historian, political scientist, and journalism scholar. So Dr. Jacobs, if you want to take us through some initial impressions.
Sure. Thanks, Austin. Thanks to each of you for joining us here today, and thanks to all of you. Initial impressions. So we'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes about sort of the history of the primary season and primary process. One of the things I find really interesting is that effectively both parties have had the party shut down the primary system in practical terms, which is one of the things that the whole primary system was meant to try to avoid. Was party control of the political system. So we'll talk some more about that. So that's one of the initial impressions of it. I also think the nature of both parties at this moment in time suggests that maybe we have the opportunities for some new voices coming in, not necessarily in 24 as it turns out, but down the line there may be some more opportunities, because I'm not sure that the American populace is really thrilled with the way this primary season is playing out overall. And I'm not talking about the selection of the ultimate candidates, but the fact that it has shut down so quickly, really, that by this day, there is no Florida primary. There is a Republican Party primary, but again, there are no real opposition candidates to Trump, who has effectively locked up the nominee. And certainly there is no Democratic Party primary even being held for the presidential level, which of course could harm down ballot options as well there. So that's something more we can talk about over time.
Thank you so much. Dr. Hutchens, your initial impressions?
Sure. So to follow up what Dr. Jacobs is saying, one of the most unique things about this primary is how short it is, right? And so from a media perspective, that's something that we've been focusing on. So we're already going to have the longest general election campaign sort of ever. And so how is that going to roll out? And also from a communication perspective, one of the things why I love my field is because I will never have the same election twice, because communication changes, right? So we're already now thinking about the general election and what is going to be the role of TikTok, even though it's banned in Florida. I know y'all are using it, right? And so all of those sorts of things. How are we going to see candidates shift? And how did we see candidates shift to different platforms during this primary season? But again, the biggest thing from a communication perspective is that we're already in the general election.
Awesome. And we'll definitely have lots more questions about certain ways that the media covers campaign elements later on, and I'm certain from the audience as well. Thank you so much. And Dr. Robbins, any impressions?
So one of the interesting things from a political science perspective, first on the short primary season, we've been concerned about the front loading of primaries for some time. The fact that two very small states with very small electorates whittle down the primary process so that by the time a large state like California or Florida or Texas get the opportunity, there's not much choice. But the other thing that's very interesting from a political science perspective is usually we either have an open seat race or we have a challenger to an incumbent. And in this year, we actually have essentially two incumbents, even though one of those incumbents has been out for 4 years. So it's going to be kind of interesting in the sense that some of the normal things we use to predict outcomes will be somewhat challenged. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
Thank you so much. Dr. Jacobs, we'll start with you. And if you could give us maybe a little bit of a rundown on where the primary process came from and how the progressive era contextualizes this development. So how did we get here?
Yeah, so the biggest thing to think about right up front is that primaries haven't always existed, right? So they didn't exist before 1900. So it's in really 1904 moving forward where the progressives, which is a movement that's about reform in American politics, there's also kind of a cynical take I'll get to on that in just a second, really start trying to address party elite control of the political process and try to open up that process for more, if you will, democratic engagement, meaning more citizen engagement in the process. Their concerns were twofold. One, the party elites controlled it. Prior to that, there was a convention system, but there was no avenue for direct primary election of candidates. And then the other piece was, this is also the moment where you have dramatic immigration to the United States taking place. Between 1880 and 1920, about 20 million people migrate to the United States. And what that means is, in the political sense, where are those political participants sort of engaging in the system? And it's through their local communities, and that is what gave political party bosses control, because it's through the pub, it's through other kind of gathering sites in local communities where party bosses could really exercise that control and say, no, you will support these candidates or those candidates, or you won't support this candidate, et cetera. So the progressives were trying to both bring some order to a system, but also find a way to gain some control over immigrant party politics as well. So by 1916, 1920, almost half of all states had primaries. So very quickly, basically over the course of 3 or 4 election cycles, you go from no primaries to about half, it's 25 out of 48 states, have them by the time you get to 1920. But then you enter a conservative era of politics that pulls that back. And 8 states in the 1920s and 1930s actually get rid of primaries. So the whole primary process as we really know it is a post-World War II construct as well. And we can come back and talk about some more of that if we want to in a few minutes.
Absolutely. And would you actually want to go into a little bit of how that evolved after the Progressive era and after World War II?
Yeah, sure. So I think when you, the election of 1948 is really, really important here, and then heading into 52 and 56. So 48, you might not be aware of this, the Democratic Party fractures. So Thomas Dewey was a Republican candidate in 44, was again the Republican candidate, he's New York governor, in 1948. But the Democratic Party fractures. So Truman had succeeded FDR when he passed away. He runs in 48, and he is, if you will, kind of the mainline Democratic candidate. To his right within the Democratic Party, Strom Thurmond breaks off the Dixiecrats in the South and runs as a third-party candidate there. To the left, Henry Wallace, who was a previous vice presidential candidate, or vice president, I should say, under FDR, runs to his left and splits off with the Progressive Party. Truman emerges from that, actually, not only as the nominee for the Democratic Party, he actually emerges victorious in a 4-party race where Dewey had been heavily favored. Where this matters in the primary system is that this becomes a moment where people start saying, wait, we need more access to the populace, right? And so you also have new media starting to emerge, TV, for example, where people can then go directly over the heads of the party bosses to the population. And in 52, Adlai Stevenson, who's ultimately the Democratic Party nominee, skips most of the primary season. Estes Kefauver from Tennessee wins 12 of 15 primaries, but Stevenson is picked by the party at the convention to be the candidate because he had bypassed that system and gone directly to the populace and was quite popular more generally. And so then by the time you get to 60, the Kennedy election, he actually wins a majority of the primaries, but he is actually, the party elite want LBJ to be the candidate, but they can't ignore the will of the people that's been expressed through the primaries. So Kennedy gets selected as the candidate at the convention, but he makes the offer to LBJ to be his vice president. There's some debate over how serious that offer was, but it ended up coming to fruition. And So that period from 48 to 60 is where you really see this evolution of the primary system to become quite significant. But still, in 68, only 34 to 37% on the Democrat and Republican sides of delegates were actually selected through the primary process. And it's not until you get up into the 70s that it exceeds a majority of the delegates actually being selected through the primary process. So that's within my lifetime that the primary process becomes the primary, not political party primary, but the main way that delegates are actually selected. But still, each party reserves some delegate selection for the party themselves. So you would have seen this in 2016 in the Democratic side with Clinton and Sanders elections, because Clinton is sort of the choice of the party elite, if you will, has those party delegates that aren't necessarily from the primary side that she locks up fairly quickly too. And so again, there's that balance that remains with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Jacobs. Keep some of those dates in mind for later on in the program. So this next question is going to be directed at Dr. Robbins. However, for the three of you, feel free to bounce off each other if you want as well, because we know you guys obviously have very overlapping areas of expertise. There was talk of how the primary system has kind of changed and how parties are reasserting control. Do you think that the current state of American politics has anything to do with that, and how has particularly polarization changed the way primaries are run?
Excuse me. I'm not sure that polarization has actually changed the way that primaries are run so much as primaries are taking advantage of polarization. I think it might work the other way. And it can work yes or no. On this one, I think that the primaries can really capitalize on hyperpartisanship. They can capitalize on ideology. Primaries have a different electorate than a general election, and it tends to be more conservative or more liberal than the general public. And to win the primary, we have this thing in political science called the median voter theorem. You need to capture that middle voter, and that's going to be to the left or to the right. So it just depends. I really think the primary system, if you are using closed primaries, really captures the polarization, but if you're using open primaries, doesn't do so much.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone...
No, I mean, I agree with what Dr. Robbins is saying. I think one thing that we're seeing is differences is in the rhetoric, perhaps, of the candidates during a primary season. But that is because you're speaking to a different electorate, right? And so some of the things that I've looked at has been, how does elite polarization or elite rhetoric then influence the average individual? And we are seeing effective polarization, right? Which there's lots of different ways that you can look at a polarization. But in particular, effective polarization, which is how much I like my group and how much I dislike the other group, is increasing, just straight up increasing. If you look at sort of the best data sources, the American National Election Study has been tracking this for a really long time. How much we like our own party is flat. How much we like the other party is tanking. When they first started asking it, it was around 70 for our own party, around 50 for the other party. In the 2020 data set, it was 17 and 19. Was the average thermometer rating. So that is something that I think, right, polarization is picking up on. And so when we're looking at citizens as in the primary season, when we're competing for the edges, right, that rhetoric, I think, gets amplified in a way that's not super great for.
I would add that the candidates we've had of late, particularly at the presidential level, in many cases capitalize on this affective partisanship or negative partisanship, whichever term you want to use, that they are tapping into this using, we call it red meat sometimes, but tapping into these ideas to sort of move and sway people at a sort of a visceral level. And that's not the primary system so much as the dynamics of campaigns more generally, I think.
And if I could just add one thing, I don't think it's polarization per se, but to go back to your earlier point on our kind of reactions to the primary season about the longest general election campaign, if you think about it in those terms, Trump participated in the primary campaign in the sense that he got his name on the ballot in as many states as he could, right? I'm not talking about Colorado and Illinois where he was disallowed, although obviously the Supreme Court overturned those. But he got his name on the ballot, so he participated, but he refused to participate in the other performative aspects of the primary season. He wouldn't debate. He wouldn't do those other things. He launched his general campaign instead of a primary campaign. Biden effectively did the same thing, right? In that he, in many cases, well, there's been no debate, and in many cases, Florida being one of them, there was no presidential primary in the state, right? So he also has engaged to the extent that he has in the general election campaign, even before the primary arrived in this state or in other states. So it's not necessarily polarization impacting the primary season itself or the primary process, but this year, the nature of these two candidates has drastically impacted the primary system. And part of that factor goes back to the partisanship and the nature of primaries being overtly more partisan than the general too, right?
Definitely. This is without a doubt a very strange and interesting primary season, to be sure. To go off of that, Dr. Hutchens, I'd love to hear maybe generally how the primary elections are covered differently by the media as compared to the general elections, and if this difference affects election outcomes, and feel free to comment also on how this primary season may be different and how the media is covering it.
Right. I mean, I'll start with that, and the answer is yes, right? And I think it's very much to the point that Dr. Robbins made that it was two incumbents, right? So it would sort of, we have weird candidates, right? There was a primary season, but it was a little bit different. How we typically look at coverage is electability, is what's getting focused on a lot in the primary season. A lot of coverage gets viewed negatively because they focus on something called the horse race, right? So the idea being that mostly what we're looking at in news media is who's winning or losing. Because essentially, right, a thing about news, a thing about media is it needs to be new, right? It's in the title. And so you can only talk about policy positions so many times before it's known, right? And so that's why a lot of the political coverage really focuses on, well, what's the new thing? The new thing is this new poll that's telling us who's winning and who's losing, and that's what we tend to focus on. And so a lot of sort of the more mainstream coverage in a primary season has an eye essentially to that already, right? So who is going to be electable? When we're talking about the candidates, yes, there will be some discussion of policy positions, but usually the differences in policy positions are really small, right? Like within party, you're going to have more in common than you do that are different from each other. So it's thinking about, well, who's going to do better later? Who's polling higher in swing states? And why do we think that's going to matter? And that tends to drive a lot of our coverage and a lot of what we're looking at. We still had some of that this year, but not for a while. It's been more than a year, I think, was the last time that DeSantis was above Trump in like a poll. And so once Trump took the lead, it switched, right? The conversation around the primary really sort of switched to more of what is the general election. So this is where you see candidates taking advantage of non-mainstream media, taking advantage of their owned media. So doing things in social, doing things on their websites, because then it's about how can I try to impact the party platform? What are things that I can do that I can try to push ideas or things that I want to have happen at the convention? And so that's where we're seeing a lot more benefit with individual candidates' owned media, because mainstream is just who's going to win most of the time.
Does anyone else want to comment on that or have any thoughts? All right. Dr. Robbins, I'm wondering, going somewhat off of maybe getting some media attention, are there certain traits in a candidate that you see in the primary elections that help predict their success in the general elections? And maybe how do those strategies change between the primaries and the general election?
So one of the most important things that we don't talk about in the primary season is the money primary. It happens well before the first primary, and it's why people like Jeb Bush drop out well before the first vote's cast. And it's not just getting small donors. This is really getting the institutional donors, the big donors, trying to make sure that you have it set up. So one of the things you want to look for going into a candidate and thinking about what would help predict is how well they can raise money from both kinds of donors, both large and small. Small donors are important because not just symbolically, but because when you commit to $10 or $15 to an election, you're going to vote. And that means you're going to turn out. You're much more easily persuaded to get out. You're looking for voter cues in a primary, and if you don't have name recognition, here we've got 2 incumbents, so you're fighting against that. We're looking for name recognition. You're looking for how well you've organized in those smaller early primaries to see if you can scale that up to 50 different states. That's the sort of thing, and that's, again, where money really plays out. So you're looking to see how well they're raising money from the establishment, and that matters. As always, you're going to be looking at your strengths and weaknesses, but it's really, I think, to be able to go the long haul, you're looking at how much money they're raising, how they're spending it, are they wasting it, what's their over-under on all of that. And it's somewhat in the stories. It's sometimes not as flashy as the latest debate, but it's there, and there were stories just yesterday on the fundraising as well.
Can I add something that connects your 2 points together? One is the money piece and the polling / horse race piece, and this goes back to the primary aspect in particular. The Republican Party this year, to get on the stage in debates, you had to, for each successive debate, you had to amass a higher polling number and a larger number of unique donors too. So I forget, for the first debate, it was or second debate, it was something around 40,000 unique donors, and you had to be polling above 3% amongst the Republican candidates, right? So the communication piece and the donor piece are actually really closely connected and help people try to understand what is the viability of this candidate in the individual primary that you're talking about, but also on the national scale. So those two are fundamentally connected, and the Republican Party made that explicit this year in the primary process through the debates in particular.
Thank you, Dr. Did you have a follow-up?
I was just to say it's another way of getting control, right? It's a way of controlling who can be on that stage and limit chaos.
Thank you. So in light of that, one thing that we've seen, obviously, in light of getting those unique donors, those individuals, is it was mentioned the role of media, both social and news, is bigger than ever. Dr. Hutchens, how do smaller candidates differentiate themselves and gain media attention during primaries?
They do crazy things, to be honest, right? Is sort of the most simple way to put it. Because if you aren't polling well or you don't have the donors, the biggest way to do it is to have some sort of viral moment, right? So if you're in a debate, right, this is one of the things that you do. So, and that was sort of a weird thing about this year's primary, because they were talking around Trump, who didn't appear, right? Because he chose to start his, general election campaign earlier. But so a lot of the moments, right? And so if we're tracking attention afterwards, there's different ways that you can see how people are paying attention to different moments in the debate. When does everybody start retweeting or sharing, right? What are they doing during an actual debate? And so we create sort of these viral moments that then has a peak of attention, right? Does something to help you get eyes on you for as long as you can. Again, maybe some of the candidates think they're actually going to be president. I think a lot of them, right, know that what they're doing is they're trying to move their platform, right? So they're having those moments at the debate stage So it becomes part of the conversation, right? Now it's something, we had a viral moment. Now we know about something called basic income. How many people knew about a thing called basic income prior to 2020? Not a whole lot, right? But then it became a moment at a debate. Now we're more aware of the candidate, right? Now we're like, gang? Oh, I know who, right? In New York. And so that's something that they're doing a lot. And so they're going to have to do something that is bigger and more extreme to have those viral moments.
Thank you. And along the lines of smaller candidates and how the type of campaign has changed over time, Dr. J, you gave a great rundown earlier of a lot of the names from some of those specific years. How did the emergence of the primary process change the kind of candidates we saw in presidential elections?
So over the long term, I think there's obviously been a huge change. When you think about it at the incremental levels at different moments in time, you see some things are like, well, is that really that different? Early on, the first individual to really try to drive the primary process forward was a Wisconsin governor, Robert La Follette. And then in the 1912 election, Teddy Roosevelt, as somebody who had been a prior president, was running against the incumbent Taft, and then was also running against Woodrow Wilson, is able to use his access, again, with visibility, to get back out there and do some things that maybe he would not have been able to in a prior era. When you fast forward, again, the 48 and 52 elections are really, really interesting here, because even though it's not done through the primary process in 48, the fact that you could have Strom Thurmond hoping to get to a contested convention and then be able ultimately to hope to get to a contested election, to hope to get enough electoral votes, even though he'd gone outside the primary process, to hope that he could get a negotiated election where the Dixiecrats' points of view would have to be incorporated into the resolution of the election itself. That's a way where you see basically this populist aspect, this notion of, hey, we're going to try to take our voice directly to the people. That's what the primary system, even though that's happening outside of the primaries, that's what the primary system was intended to try to do, was to give you, me, everyone else more direct engagement opportunities. Now, again, when you fast forward, the ironic part is that, of course, now you've got two candidates in 2024 who could basically say, yeah, well, the heck with that, right? We're just going to kind of do it the way we want to do it, because they control the party power to be able to do that. And you've seen this just in the last week and a half, especially with the Republican National Committee takeover and the changes that have happened there on the Republican side. But Biden, on the Democratic side, again, the fact that there is no presidential primary in the state of Florida also says, look, the party elite have decided that this is the direction that we're going to go largely by this point, right? So that kind of has turned it on its head from going back 120 years ago or 116 years ago.
Definitely. Many people also have, maybe concerns is not the right word, but confusion about the closed and open primaries and the differences between those. Maybe if you could take us through, Dr. Robbins, some of the merits of the closed primaries, maybe some of the drawbacks and sort of those differences that exist.
So closed and open, and then there's, of course, the California jungle primary, but the closed and open primaries generally give some degree of control to the parties. Right. So basically, if you're in a state like Florida, you have to choose a party and affiliate with it. And you can only vote if you affiliate with the Republican Party. You can only vote in the Republican primary. You'd have to change your vote if you wanted to vote in it today. Right. You have to do it. Change your registration a couple of weeks back. So closed gives the party much more control over the process. The elites get more of an opportunity to say, but it also means you're more likely to have a more ideological constituency there, and so it's likely that you're going to get a further right or further left candidate in those situations. In an open primary, you don't have that situation. Independents would be able to vote in that particular primary. And I know that Nikki Fried, who's the Florida Democratic chair, has talked about opening up the Democratic primary, not for today, obviously, because we didn't have one, but in August when we talk about Congress and all the downstate ballots, to independents. So opening up this process. And the argument isn't that the Democratic Party needs to have control over it. In fact, maybe there's a group of the Democratic Party that they're trying to take the control from. It's the argument is allowing people to participate more in the process might help build the party up a little bit more. So that would be the option there. The risk, of course, is losing control over the message of the Democratic Party in the state of Florida, which is a fairly complicated party setup given North versus South and East and West and all the other parts of Florida. So that's the basics of that. If you want a more ideological candidate, go closed. If you want to build support among a larger electorate, you might find it more useful to go open.
And Dr. J, we'll finish up with one final question for you, and maybe one of the most important questions to conclude on. Do you think that the primaries as a whole have met the goals of the progressive and populist movements that began them?
It depends on which goals you want to talk about, right? So has it over the long term, has it opened up the process? Yes, it has, right? Even if in doing so, it's, again, going back to the open versus closed thing, it's allowed for more ideologically driven candidates in closed primaries. It drives to the edges instead of to the middle. More open primaries tend to drive you, the candidates of those parties, more towards a general election mindset, which is to say they're trying to appeal for independence or whatever there, so they tend to be less on the ideological extremes of their parties. So in that sense, yes, it's opened things up, definitely, right? If you go back to the Progressive Party notion, again, sort of that cynical side, brief tangent, if you're ever in a history Ph.D. program, one of the most common qualifying exam questions is define the Progressive Party. Yes, I had to answer that question on my qualifying exams. So is it the cynical side that says, hey, they're about trying to rein in immigrants and all these other things, or it's the reform-minded, or it's the managerial revolution piece? It brought some order to the process, which progressives were about bringing order, but it didn't necessarily bring out or eliminate some of the unruliness that would come through the increasing ideological nature of it and so on. So a bit of a long-winded / tangent answer there, but hopefully that addresses it.
No, sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, like many things in politics, it's a mixed bag, essentially, is the answer. We're now going to move on to audience Q&A. If you're here in person, you can just raise your hand. We will have a microphone going around to anyone who has a question. And if you're online, you can make use of the chat function, so you can chat your question out. So if we have any questions from the audience, we can have a raise of hands.
I'm going to forget half this question halfway through. So I think what's interesting, something we've seen is that in, I suppose the two analogous elections would be 2016 and 2022, where in 2016, a lot of the Democratic establishment got very mad at Bernie Sanders for running against Hillary Clinton in the primary. But interestingly now, I mean, he's not as isolated as you would expect. You might expect him to be kind of put in the corner, no committee assignments or anything. And in 2022, there was a lot of coverage about how Republicans underperformed, particularly due to weak candidates who were more ideological. And yet we have someone with the last name Trump, in a prominent Republican Party position. So there seems to be an interplay between how the party is dealing with these more ideological factions where they're not quite pushing back. I don't know what the question is. What do you think of that?
That's a hard question. So the question really is about party control of the various elements of it. And there's a long history of the parties having challenges to do this. So the whole story of 1948 really plays out here. The Democratic Party coming out of the New Deal was the biggest umbrella, the biggest tent party there could have been. You had African Americans and Ku Klux Klanners together in the same party, which is just bizarre, right? And so parties are far more fractionalized than we realize in the United States. They're not nearly as disciplined as European parties, for example. I think that on the right, the personality of Trump is part of what keeps it tighter. But when candidates aren't running, candidates can't be guaranteed that that will help them, right? There is some backlash to that. And so I think it just depends on some idiosyncratic factors in some of those areas. I don't know that there's much, well, definitely in the House side, on the Republican side in the House, the ability to punish unruly members, such as a Matt Gaetz or something like that, is non-existent. They can't do it. They need every single person they've got to pass any kind of legislation. So there's no ability to do that. The same is kind of this on the other side in the Senate. It's very narrow, so you need every person on board. So punishing is just not going to happen.
Yeah, so that would mean on the Democratic side in the Senate, there's been a lot of angst over Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, right? You know, in their kind of oscillating on different issues, and so those are, I think, we're really instructive parallels there. I also think, though, there's another piece to your question, and that goes to what does the platform look like coming out of conventions? And you know, there's two illustrative examples on the Republican side, one on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, you've got 1976, where Gerald Ford had been Nixon's vice president, becomes president when he resigns, and he has a primary challenge from Ronald Reagan, and that goes to the convention. And in that convention, ultimately Ford is selected, but he actually has to try to bring on board some of Reagan's platform to be able to go forward. 1980 is a Democratic example where Carter is the incumbent president and has a challenge from Ted Kennedy. And there Kennedy holds out to the last day before finally endorsing Carter for the presidency and gives probably Kennedy's most famous speech there. But then when you get to 2020, note that there is no formal Republican Party platform in the presidential election in 2020, right? So one of the things to think about with that is how do the party platforms themselves and the convention process work in tandem with the primary process and what comes out of it to address some of these issues too, where you're trying to deal with the intra-party conflict and tension. Sometimes it's not done through punishment per se, it's done through what happens with the platforms and how those get navigated.
Thank you so much. We have another question.
Hello. I just had a quick question. Do you notice any differences between how the parties run each primary? If so, are these like trends or do they seem to change every year?
There are definitely differences. I mean, again, within states, each party can determine to some extent the rules of its own primaries. So states have obviously their own, have election laws for the state, but obviously for the federal elections are also federal election laws. But there aren't really that many rules for how the parties set up the primary process. There is nothing, for example, this is one of the things that drives frustration over the course of the 19th century. There's very little in the Constitution that defines how federal elections are supposed to happen at the state level or anything along those lines. That's one of the things that generates Supreme Court cases about whether or not a state can kick somebody off a ballot or not, right? You know, even as recently as, I don't know, 2024. So that's a long-term thing. So there can be significant differences with how states do things depending on the level of state laws in place. I mean, how parties run primaries in states depending on the types of laws that exist. So generally the laws are open primary, closed primary, right? But or a caucus or something along those lines, right? But or jungle, right? So I'll leave that to Suzanne to explain the jungle primary. But there can be, but those are normally done at the state level, and so there's not usually a significant difference. Like Iowa caucuses are Iowa caucuses, whether you're Democrats or Republicans in that sense, right? It's not a primary for the Republicans and a caucus for the Democrats. They tend to have a same process like that, but they can have some different rules that define how those operate. Because the parties do have significant power in that.
So, might explain a jungle?
Yeah.
Oh. So a jungle primary or a blanket primary or any of the other terms that they use, and sometimes lawyers might get a little bit more picky about these things, but the basic point is in California, they don't have a party primary. Everybody runs on the same ballot, and the top two go on to the general. So you could have two Democrats run against each other in the general, or two Republicans run against each other in the general. It's a little bit different kind of process where they've removed that. And I was going to go back to the Constitution. One of the challenges that the people writing that Constitution had to figure out was how to balance power between a central government, the Federalists, and the states. And the states won the electoral battle. The states got to choose the time, mostly everything about elections. And it's been over time through amendments that we've kind of tweaked that a little bit and other things. So that's one of the reasons why, and it's a very decentralized process. Our electoral system is amazing and how well it works, given how decentralized it is, down to the county level and down to volunteers essentially running election day. So it's an amazing thing that we pull off every few months because we have a lot of elections.
Definitely. We have another question over on this side.
Yeah. So in the beginning, we kind of talked about the uniqueness of the American primary system. And what I really want to kind of get at is the nominating process for candidates. We are one of the only advanced democracies in which parties have given up the ability to nominate their own candidates. And I just want to ask, I guess, is this overall a good thing that we're giving so much power to the people without any sort of guardrail from the party of having an elite say within the nominating process, especially considering post-2016 when Democrats abolished superdelegates having their first vote after the Bernie Sanders conflict, and the Republican Party not having any sort of superdelegates that can kind of counteract an extreme or candidates unbeneficial to democracy.
Well, I would say I certainly take the point of your question, but I still think the parties do exercise control in different ways. So again, who gets on a debate stage? Does a party hold a debate? Those are two examples right in the 2024 election where you see the party exercising control in different ways. Now, again, Trump operated in his own way by saying, well, I'm not going to participate. And the Republican Party sort of said, okay. But the rules for how you actually got on a debate stage meant that you had to have a certain number of donors. You had to have be polling a certain amount. So the party still exercised control there by determining who could actually be part of the competition, if you will, right? And then you could also think about other ways that the party might still exercise some control. So even at the state level, again, they play roles in determining whether there will be a primary or not. It wasn't, the Florida Democratic Party could have held a presidential primary had they wanted to, right? They made a choice not to do so. There's nothing in state law that told them that they didn't have to. There was nothing in terms of federal law that said, oh, wait, you've got an incumbent who's running, so no primary, right? That was a state party choice and done in concert with the national party to make that choice, so the party said, look, we're going to tell you who your options are in this instance, right? I mean, so they're exercising some control. So we're not in a situation where they have totally abdicated and turned over, even though we do have a primary process, they're still exercising some power in that process.
Thank you so much. Are there any
I was going
thoughts?
to say, I suspect that on the whole superdelegate thing, They'll come back and add those back in at some point. They did that, what was that, after 68? So after 1968, the Democratic Convention was a bit of a disaster. And the Democrats were also recognizing that they didn't necessarily like some of the candidates they were choosing in the end, and they wanted to exercise more control. So these things oscillate. I suspect it'll move back in that direction at some point.
All right, we have another question over on that side. Please, yeah.
Hey guys. My question ties back to early states and basically how indicative they are of who the nominee will be. Because I'm just remembering back to 2020 where if you had just seen Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada, you'd think, oh, this is either a sweep for Bernie Sanders or, a close second from Pete Buttigieg. And obviously neither of them were the nominee. Obviously when we got to South Carolina, that's when Biden actually started taking the stage. So I guess my question is, throughout history, so maybe a question for Dr. J is, have the early states been indicative of the winner of the primary in general?
Certainly that's become more of an issue more recently. Again, because the up until the 70s, primaries weren't even selecting a majority of the delegates. So I don't want to say it was unimportant. It was important, but it wasn't nearly as relevant as it has been in, say, the last 15 to 20 years. Then you also had the real evolution of Super Tuesday coming, especially the first Super Tuesday, I forget which election, it was in the late 70s or early 80s, I forget which one exactly. But then you got to the point where there's 15 states going on Super Tuesday, so that those early primaries could certainly narrow the field, but Super Tuesday became hugely significant. And again, that's not the case this year, but you only have to go back to 2020 to start seeing, the level of significance. And if you really want to look at it, 16 and 08, with Obama on the Democratic side in 08, you can really see some significance there too. So it's certainly important, and it certainly provides a lot of hand-wringing in the press and other places about the role of the early states in narrowing the field. And it certainly took out some significant candidates in 2024 on the Republican side. We saw that happen, certainly. But it kind of waxes and wanes. But it's really kind of a last 30 years issue, generally speaking, I would say.
The early primaries are important as well, because if you're the front runner and you don't do well, that's bad. Right? And if you are second or third when you weren't expected to be second or third, that could really, really jumpstart your campaign. I think McCain in 2008 in particular was not doing well in the November before the primary system, had no money. He was really struggling, and then had that really nice New Hampshire run there that made a difference. And so there's the elements there, especially since the media is really paying attention, of the front runner just couldn't bring it home. And suddenly looks weak. And so winning isn't necessarily everything in those first ones. The other thing, I think from 2024, which we haven't really talked about so much, is that the early primaries showed that in the Republican side that there were significant areas within the Republican Party that did not support the eventual nominee, right? So that supported Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis. And those voters will eventually come home. They usually do, but it does show that there is a fairly significant part of the party, 30 to 40%, that want something different. And that's not a 10% or 5%. That's a huge number.
But if you look at actual public opinion polling, it's a majority on both Democrats and Republicans who say they wish they had a different candidate. So. No, there's
I mean in terms of the primaries.
Right. So nothing to run against it, but
Yeah.
we have two candidates in the longest general election cycle ever
Who are unlikely.
that are not liked by the majority of their party.
That have the highest unfavorables, right?
Right.
Both of them have the highest unfavorables, in terms of public opinion.
Right.
Polling, yeah.
We'll take one more question in the white shirt in the back there.
So I have a two-parter. The first part is looking at the lack of a Florida Democratic Party primary. Could that be considered a failure of the party, or would it be more accurate to say that that is a failure of the failed candidates who did not submit their names to the party when the party already advertised that? Per the party bylaws, when you only have one candidate, you cancel the primary. And then also, is it accurate to use the term elites? We've heard that term a lot tonight. When really becoming a so-called elite is a very democratic procedure. It's the people who volunteer, the people who dedicate their time. It's some of the people who donate money, but really anyone can become an elite with enough work.
I'll take the semantic question as the, communication person in the room. I think when we're talking about elites, if you are it's not saying that you are born into the elite role and anyone can become them. But once you are them, you are them. You are the elites, right? If you are in Congress, you are elite. So I don't know. I think that's a semantic quibble rather than an actual difference.
They're the deciders, right? They're the ones that ultimately decide the allocation of resources for the party. And it doesn't matter if you are socioeconomic elites or not, you're a political elite. And I think that's really what we're talking about, is political elites.
On the first question, which it's a serious question that deserves a serious answer too, right? So I think one of the things to think about is what leads to a situation whereby you have no other candidates coming into the process, right? That was not an accident necessarily. I agree, yes, there were published bylaws, there was a published process that anyone could have participated in to get a name on a ballot, let's put it that way, right? But if you look at it, there are various news agencies cover this all the way back to 2022. This sort of, the higher up the party you go on the Democratic side, the more support there has been to have Biden be the nominee. The lower down the party you go, the more frustration there is with that process, right? And so those stories were coming out in 2022. They're still coming out today. They've been covered by news organizations from the left, the center, the right, and that story is pretty similar, right? And so what that also tells you is the party structure, not just in the state of Florida, but more broadly nationwide, has had, I think, significantly differing views from those who are exercising levers of power. So I would call them elite in that sense, not necessarily automatically in a socioeconomic sense, but in terms of the power they can exercise. There's one level of engagement there. There's a very different level of engagement from anyone in this room who might not be somebody who has their hand on that lever of power in the same way. So it's a fair point to raise, but you have to ask the question, why did we end up in that situation? And it's not just a consequence of the Democratic Party of Florida, right? That is a larger national conversation where people said, wait a second, is this where I'm going? Is this the moment that I'm going to step in or not to try to do something? Do I have the groundswell of support behind me? Do I have the party infrastructure that's willing to engage with me and support me? And the answer there was a firm no, certainly at the national level, that the party infrastructure was very clearly going to be supporting Biden in this election, right? And that's been the case. It's been clear since 2022 because the coverage is out there on that.
Thank you so much for taking some time to speak with us. Dr. Jacobs, Dr. Hutchens, Dr. Robbins, thank you. And if we could get another round of applause for our wonderful panelists tonight. That ends the panel portion of tonight's events. Please enjoy the catering, and we'll be starting the presidential pandemonium trivia in just a few moments. So stay tuned. It'll be fun. Thank you all.